The bells at St. Anne's were still ringing when my legs gave out. I remember the cold of the stone floor against my cheek before I remember anything else. Not the pain in my chest, not the voices, not the panic. Just that strange marble cold seeping into my face, while Father Dyron's voice carried on from the pulpit, oblivious for a few seconds longer than I would have wished. My name is Geraldine Marchetti Boudreau. I am 68 years old. I live in a small bungalow off Mountain Road in Moncton, New Brunswick, the kind of house where the paint on the back porch peels every other spring and the rhododendrons take 3 tries to bloom. I had been a widow for 11 years that morning and a mother for 42. I went to St. Laint. Anne's every Sunday at 10, sat in the 4th pew from the front on the left side, and put a folded 20 into the collection basket because my husband, Aldous, had done it for 36 years before he passed. And habits like that are how you keep the dead close. That morning, I'd made oatmeal with brown sugar and a splash of cream. I'd watched the chickadees fighting over the suet feeder. I'd called my granddaughter Brianna in Calgary to wish her a happy 13th birthday, and she'd told me her mother said I couldn't come visit this summer because the spare room was being painted. I'd hung up and stood in the kitchen for a long time holding the phone before I put on my good coat and walked the 3 blocks to church. I don't remember collapsing. I remember the bells, and I remember the cold floor, and then I remember a woman's voice, not familiar, much younger than mine, saying, stay with me, my love, the ambulance is coming." I remember being lifted. I remember the sky through the open ambulance doors, a piercing prairie-style blue you don't usually get in February in the Maritimes. I remember thinking, almost peacefully, so this is how it happens. And then, nothing for 3 days. When I came back to myself, the first face I saw wasn't my daughter Annalise. It wasn't her husband Ridge either, though I wouldn't have expected him. It wasn't Brianna, who I would have forgiven anything for being too young and too far away. It was a young woman I didn't know, sitting in the visitor's chair beside my bed with a paperback novel folded open on her lap and a Tim Hortons cup gone cold on the windowsill behind her. She had her dark hair pulled back in a clip, and she was wearing a pilled gray cardigan that looked like it had been washed 300 times. When she noticed my eyes were open, she set the book down very carefully, like she was afraid sudden movement might send me away again. "Mrs. Imagery, Marchetti Boudreau," she said. Oh, thank God. I tried to speak and nothing came out but a dry click. She had a paper cup of ice chips ready before I'd even finished trying. She tipped one into my mouth like I was a baby bird. "My name is Yolanda," she said. "Yolanda Sapinka. I was sitting behind you at the 8 o'clock service when you fell. I rode with you in the ambulance. I've been here since Sunday." It was Wednesday. "My daughter," I tried to say. My voice was a rusted hinge. Yolanda looked down at her hands. She had short, unpolished nails, the kind of hands that did real work. "The doctor's been trying," she said carefully. I think they called her 40-something times. 47 as it turned out. I learned the number later from the chart. 47 calls over 3 days to the cell number my daughter had given the hospital as her emergency contact when I'd had my gallbladder out in 2019. 47 calls that had gone to voicemail to a recorded message in a perky chirp that said, "Hi, you've reached Anna. Leave it after the beep." The cardiologist, a kind man named Dr. Naveed Corey, came in shortly after I woke up and sat down on the edge of my bed in a way I knew meant he was about to deliver something delicate. He told me I'd had what they called a STEMI, a major heart attack. He told me they put a stent in my left anterior descending artery, which apparently is the one that kills you fastest if it goes untreated, the one cardiologists call the widowmaker. He told me I'd been clinically dead for about 90 seconds in the ambulance. He told me Father Doyeron had given me last rites in the emergency room before they'd taken me up for the catheterization, because at that point nobody had known if I'd come back. He paused for a long moment then. He glanced at Yolanda, who was pretending very hard to read her book. "We weren't able to reach your daughter," he said. "We tried for 3 days. We left messages. We had social work try the home number, the office number she's listed at the dental practice. We didn't get through. "It's all right, dear," I said, though my voice still wasn't quite mine. "She's busy." He didn't argue with me. He's a good doctor, Dr. Corey. He didn't say what he was thinking. He just patted my hand and told me a physiotherapist would be in to see me in the morning and that I'd be transferred out of cardiac ICU later that afternoon if I kept doing well. After he left, I asked Yolanda for my purse. She handed it over. I pulled out my phone. Someone had thoughtfully kept it charged, and I would learn later it was her, and I opened up Facebook because I am old enough that Facebook is still where I look for my family. The first thing on my feed was a photograph posted by Annalise the previous afternoon, Tuesday, day 2 of me in a coma. She and Ridge and Brianna were on a beach somewhere with palm trees. Annalise was in a sun hat holding a cocktail in a coconut, smiling that big, bright wedding photo smile she's had since she was 19. The caption underneath said, "Punta Cana, baby. 5 days of pure paradise. No work, no stress, no drama. Mom finally let me breathe. Mom finally let me breathe. Mom finally let me breathe." I put the phone face down on the blanket. I closed my eyes. Outside the window, somewhere down the hall, a monitor was beeping in a steady, indifferent rhythm. Yolanda didn't say anything. She'd seen the post. I could tell. She just reached over and put her hand on top of mine, very gently, the way you'd touch a bird that had flown into a window. "I want to tell you something about my daughter, because if you only hear what comes after, you will think she was always like this, and that is not the truth. The truth is more complicated and, in some ways, worse. Annalise was a sweet child. I know every mother says that, but it was true. She used to bring me dandelions from the back lawn and arrange them in a juice glass on the kitchen table. She used to crawl into bed with Aldous and me during thunderstorms until she was nearly 12. She was the kind of girl who cried at Remembrance Day assemblies, who saved her allowance to buy a Christmas present for a little boy at school whose family was on EI. She had a soft heart. I don't know exactly when that softness calcified. Sometime in her 20s, I think. She married Ridge Hollingsworth Pell, of the Halifax Hollingsworth Pells, whose mother used to refer to me as Aldis's wife, even after she'd known me for 15 years. Ridge made very good money in commercial real estate. Annala stopped working at the daycare she'd loved and started doing what she called event coordinating, which, as far as I could tell, meant planning charity galas for causes she didn't actually care about. They bought a 4,000-square-foot house in Riverview with a heated triple garage. They got Brianna into French immersion and Suzuki violin and a private equestrian camp in the summers. And somewhere in there, I went from being her mother to being what she called, in a voice I once overheard on the phone, my Moncton problem. It was little things at first. Not coming for Thanksgiving because Ridge's family was hosting, not picking up the phone when I called on a weekday because she was in a meeting, which I eventually figured out meant getting her nails done, asking me to babysit Brianna on 3 days' notice when their nanny was sick, then forgetting to thank me, not coming to the 11th anniversary of Aldis's death because she said she had processed her grief already, and it wasn't healthy for her to dwell. I let it slide. I let it all slide. Because I am the mother, and I had been raised to believe that the mother's job is to absorb whatever the children need to throw and to keep loving them anyway. My own mother, who came over from Calabria in 1953 with 3 dresses and a missal, would have walked through fire for any of us. So I walked through fire for Annalise. I told myself she was busy. I told myself she'd come back to me when Brianna was older. I told myself the silence after I called wasn't really silence. It was just the noise of a full life. But there is a difference between a daughter who is too busy to call her mother and a daughter who watches her phone ring 47 times from the hospital where her mother is dying and chooses to keep sipping a piña colada in Punta Cana. I knew that difference now. I knew it. The way you know the weather has changed. They moved me to a step-down unit the next morning, and Yolanda came with me, carrying my little overnight bag like she'd been my daughter all along. I asked her finally why she was still there. She was 34, she told me. She worked as an admin assistant at a law office on Main Street. She had taken 3 vacation days to sit with me. Her own mother had died of cancer in the same hospital 4 years earlier, and she'd promised her mother on her deathbed that she would always sit with strangers who were dying alone, because nobody should go through that the way her mother almost had before the family had gotten to the hospital in time. "You weren't alone," she said, very simply. "That's all. That's the only thing I wanted you to know when you woke up." I cried for the first time then. Not for myself, for her mother, who had raised a girl like that. On Friday, I called Annalise. I waited until I was strong enough to keep my voice steady because I have always been my mother's daughter in that one specific way. I do not let people hear me when I am bleeding. I waited until they'd taken the IV out of my hand. I waited until Yolanda had gone home for the first time in 5 days to do laundry and feed her cat. I picked up my phone, sitting up in the hospital bed in a gown that smelled of industrial detergent, and I dialed. She picked up on the second ring. "Mom, hi. Oh my gosh, I was just about to call you back. Things have been so insane." "Annalise," I said, "I had a heart attack on Sunday morning. I've been in the hospital for 5 days. They called you 47 times. There was a silence on the line, just long enough that I could hear, behind her, the sound of waves and a steel drum band. "Oh my God," she said. "Oh my God, Mom, are you okay?" "I had no service down here. The resort Wi-Fi is awful. I just got back to the room and my phone is just blowing up." I let her talk. I let her construct the lie in real time, like watching someone build a sandcastle they didn't realize was already getting wet. I noted, distantly, that she didn't ask me where I was. She didn't ask me where hospital. She didn't ask me which hospital. She didn't ask who was with me. When she'd run out of breath, I said, "Annalise, I love you. Enjoy the rest of your vacation." And I hung up. She called back 4 times. I let it ring. I turned the phone face down on the blanket again, exactly the way I had on Wednesday, and I looked out the window at the dirty late February snow piled up in the parking lot. And I thought about my mother's missal and my husband's $20 bills in the collection basket and the cold marble floor of St. Anne's. The fall, the cardiologist had told me, would have killed me if it had happened anywhere else. If I'd been at home alone, I would have died on the kitchen linoleum. If I'd been in the car, I would have driven into a tree. I had collapsed in a building full of people who knew CPR and had a defibrillator in the vestibule, and a young woman 3 pews behind me who knew how to call an ambulance and ride in it with a stranger. I had been spared, and I had been spared in a way that left no room for misunderstanding about who, in this life, had actually shown up for me. Annalise arrived in Moncton on Tuesday, 9 days after my heart attack, 4 days after she'd come home from Punta Cana. She had not, in those 4 days, called me again after I'd hung up on her. She had texted twice. The first text said, "Mom, I really think we should talk." The second said, "I'm flying down Tuesday to discuss some things." Some things. Not to see you. Not to make sure you're okay. Some things. I had been discharged by then. Yolanda had driven me home in her little Honda Civic with the cracked windshield, and she'd come every day after work to make me dinner. Nothing fancy, scrambled eggs on toast, a tin of habitant soup, once a Thursdaire her aunt had sent down from Trois Rivières. She'd organized my pill bottles on the kitchen counter in the order I needed to take them. She'd written out the cardiac rehab schedule on the calendar on the fridge in her neat, square handwriting. When the doorbell rang Tuesday afternoon, Yolanda was in the living room with me, going over a list of foods I was supposed to avoid. I saw her tense at the sound, and I realized she'd been bracing for this. Bracing on my behalf. I opened the door. Annalise was standing on the front step with a Lululemon tote bag over her shoulder and an expression of carefully arranged concern on her face. She had a tan. Of course she did. Behind her, on the curb, was a rental car. She hadn't even brought Ridge or Brianna. "Mom," she said, and her voice cracked in that practiced way it did when she wanted something. She stepped forward to hug me. I stepped back. "Come in," I said. "Take off your boots." I watched her face flicker. She wasn't used to that voice from me. I'd never used it on her before, not even when she was a teenager, doing things she shouldn't have been doing. I had been, for 42 years, the softest person in her life. And now I was not. She came in. She saw Yolanda on the couch, and her face did a small, ugly thing, a tightening around the eyes that lasted maybe a quarter of a second before she pasted the concerned daughter expression back on. "And who's this?" she said, in a tone that meant, "Who is this stranger in your house?" "This is Yolanda Sapinka," I said. "She saved my life. She rode in the ambulance with me. She sat with me for 3 days while I was in a coma. She's been coming over to make me dinner. Yolanda, this is my daughter, Annalise." Yolanda stood up and held out her hand, polite as anything. Annalise shook it the way you shake hands with a real estate agent you don't intend to hire. "Could we have a minute, Mom?" Annalise said. "I think we need to talk privately." "Yolanda is staying," I said. "Anything you have to say to me, you can say in front of her." There was a beat. Annalise's jaw worked. Then she sat down on the wingback chair across from the couch, Aldis's old chair, though she didn't seem to notice or care, and she pulled a manila folder out of the Lululemon tote. I knew what was in the folder before she opened it. I had known what was in the folder since the moment she texted me some things. "Mom," she said in her gentlest voice, "Ridge and I have been talking, and we're so worried about you. We think it's time to start being practical. You're alone in this big house. You've had a major health event. You can't keep going up and down those stairs. We've been looking at some really lovely options in Riverview. There's a beautiful retirement residence with a continuing care wing, Annalise. And we think it would be such a load off your mind if we got things organized now, while you're still feeling well enough to make decisions so that you don't have to worry about Annalise." She stopped. The folder sat in her lap. "Show me the papers," I said. She had the grace to hesitate. Then she handed them over. I had expected a power of attorney. That's what I'd expected. A power of attorney over my finances and my health, signed quickly, while I was still groggy and grateful and on blood thinners. What I got was worse than that. It was a listing agreement for my house with a Riverview realtor I'd never met, drawn up the previous Thursday while I'd been in the step-down unit, still wearing the heart monitor, at an asking price almost $90,000 below what the house was worth. I knew what the house was worth because Aldis and I had had it assessed 2 years before he died, and I'd had it reassessed by an independent appraiser the previous fall when I was thinking about a reverse mortgage I ultimately decided against. Below the listing agreement was a draft offer to purchase. The buyer was a numbered company, 5947182 N by Inc. I looked up at my daughter. "Whose numbered company, Annalise?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. "It's Ridge's, isn't it?" "Mom, it's not. It's a legitimate offer. The market is soft right now." "The market is not soft," I said quietly. "I read the Times and transcript. The market in Greater Moncton is up 9% year over year. And this house, mortgage-free, with the backlot, is worth at least $420,000. This offer is for $310. Mom, were you going to tell me, I said, before or after I signed it? Yolanda had gone very still on the couch beside me. She was looking at her shoes. I could feel her trying to disappear, to give me privacy for this. But I'd asked her to stay, and I was glad she had. Annalise's face went through several expressions in quick succession: defensiveness, anger, and then, because she was still her father's daughter at the deepest level, a flash of real shame. It was the shame I held on to later. It was the only proof I had that the soft little girl with the dandelions was still in there somewhere, very deep down, watching what her grown self had become. But the shame passed. They always pass, those flashes and people who have made the deal Annalise had made. "Mom," she said, and her voice was hard now, dropped down into a register I'd never heard from her before. "You are 68 years old. You just had a heart attack. You were in a coma for 3 days. You're sitting in this house with a stranger you met in a hospital and you're acting like we're the problem. Ridge and I are trying to help you. We're trying to protect you from yourself. If you can't see that, get out of my house, Annalise." If you can't see that, then I don't know what to. Get out of my house. I said it quietly. I have always been able to be quiet when I am angry. It is, I think, the only frightening thing about me. She stopped talking. She gathered up the folder. She stood up. At the door, she turned back. You'll regret this, Mom. Maybe, I said, but I'll regret it less than the alternative. She left. I locked the deadbolt behind her, which I almost never did in the daytime. Then I went into the kitchen, and I sat down at the table, and I put my face in my hands. Yolanda made tea. She didn't say anything for a long time. When she did, all she said was, "Mrs. Marchetti Boudreau, do you have a lawyer?" I had a lawyer. Aldous and I had used the same lawyer for 30 years, a woman named Suzette Charbonneau-Laker, whose office was on Archibald Street and who had handled our wills, our mortgage, the buyout of Aldous's share of the print shop when he retired. She was 71 and still working 3 days a week, and she was the closest thing I had to a friend my own age, since most of my actual friends had either died or moved to be with their grandchildren. I went to see her on Thursday morning. Yolanda drove me. I brought the listing agreement and the draft offer, and I laid them on Suzette's desk, and I told her everything. Suzette read the papers twice. She took off her reading glasses. She set them down very precisely on the leather blotter. "Geraldine," she said, "I have to ask you something difficult. Ask, has your daughter ever at any point raised concerns about your capacity? Spoken to a doctor, a social worker, anyone, about whether you should be making your own decisions?" I thought about it, and then I remembered something. 2 months ago, just after Christmas, Annalise had called and asked, very casually, whether I'd been having any memory issues lately. She'd said her friend Ridge's mother had started leaving the stove on, and she just wanted to check in. I told her no, my memory was fine. I'd thought at the time that she was being sweet. I told Suzette about the call. Suzette's mouth tightened. "They were laying groundwork," she said. "If you'd signed that listing agreement under duress and then later tried to undo it, they'd already have a record of her concern about your cognition, probably also a doctor she'd called. We need to act today." We acted that day. Suzette pulled my will out of her filing cabinet, the one Aldous and I had written together in 2008, leaving everything to each other, and then, on the death of the survivor, to Annalise. She drew up a new one in front of me on her computer while I drank a glass of water and watched the snow fall outside her office window. I left the house and the bulk of my savings, about $340,000 in RRSPs and a non-registered investment account, to Yolanda Sapinka. Not all of it. I am not a fool, and I was not making this decision out of giddiness or gratitude alone. I left $40,000 to St. Minte, Anne's parish, for the food bank Father Dueron runs out of the basement. I left $10,000 to the Moncton Hospital Foundation, earmarked for the cardiac unit. I left $5,000 to the SPCA because Aldous had loved dogs. To Brianna, my granddaughter, I left $50,000 to be held in trust until her 25th birthday, with the explicit stipulation that her parents could not access it for any reason. I would not punish a child for what her mother had done. To Annalise, I left $1 Canadian. Suzette put it in the will with a perfectly straight face. To my daughter, Annalise Marchetti Hollingsworth Pell, I bequeath the sum of $1 Pell Canadian dollar in full and final satisfaction of any and all claims she may have against my estate. I also signed a new power of attorney, naming Suzette herself as my attorney for property and a woman from my cardiac rehab group named Philomena Trudeau-Levesque, who I had liked enormously for the 3 weeks I'd known her, as my attorney for personal care. Both of them had to consent, which they did. I changed the locks on the house that afternoon. I called my bank and put a verbal password on my accounts, and then I waited. Annalise figured it out 8 days later. I don't know exactly what tipped her off. Maybe she tried to access something online. Maybe Ridge's lawyer caught wind of a filing. I just know that on a Friday afternoon in early March, my phone began to ring and ring and ring. 23 times in the first hour. She left voicemails. I listened to them later. The first was bewildered. The second was angry. By the 5th, she was crying. By the 8th, she was screaming. By the 12th, she was begging. Mom, please, please, you don't understand. Ridge is going to leave me if we don't get this sorted. The business needs the equity. You can't do this to me. I'm your daughter. I'm your only daughter. Mom, please. I sat at my kitchen table with the cup of tea going cold in front of me. And I listened to the phone ring and I did not pick up. Not once. You see, I had been counting too. 47 calls to the hospital, ignored. 47 calls from a daughter to a mother she could not be bothered to put down a pina colada for. I had decided, somewhere between the cold marble floor and Suzette's leather blotter, that I owed my daughter 47 calls of silence in return, not as revenge. I want to be clear about that. I am 68 years old and I do not have the energy for revenge. I owed her the silence as a lesson, as the only thing I had left to teach her, the last and most important thing a mother can teach a child who has gone wrong, that actions have weight, and that love, even a mother's love, is not infinite when it is met with contempt. She got to 47 calls on the following Tuesday afternoon. I know because I kept track on a little notepad by the phone, the way Aldous used to tally hockey scores. After the 47th call, I picked up. Annalise, I said, I am alive. I am well. I have made my arrangements. There is nothing for us to discuss. I love you. Please do not call this number again. And I hung up. She didn't. She did call again. Of course she did, but only twice more. Both times very late at night when she'd been drinking. I didn't pick up those either. And then, eventually, she stopped. Brianna called me on her own from a friend's phone a month later. She'd heard her parents fighting, and she wanted to know if I was okay. I told her I was. I told her I loved her very much. I told her that when she was old enough, when she was 18 and could make her own choices, my door would be open to her, and that there was money set aside for her future no matter what happened between her mother and me. She cried a little. So did I. We hung up. That summer, Yolanda took me to Prince Edward Island for a week. We stayed in a little cottage in Cavendish that we booked through one of those tourism websites, and we ate lobster rolls every day, and I dipped my feet in the Northumberland Strait for the first time since Aldous and I had honeymooned in Murray Harbor in 1980. The water was as cold as the floor of St. Anne's. I sat on the red sand in a beach chair Yolanda had bought at Canadian Tire, and I watched the gulls, and I thought about how strange a life is. You spend 42 years believing your child is the center of you. You build the whole architecture of your remaining time around her. And then one morning you fall down in a church and you wake up to find that the center has moved. The center is somewhere else now. The center is a woman in a gray cardigan who didn't know your name when she picked up the phone in the ambulance and who is now sitting in a beach chair beside you peeling the wrapper off a coffee crisp and asking if you want half. I said yes. I always say yes now. The house is still mine. The garden came back this spring. The rhododendrons bloomed on the first try, for the first time in years. Yolanda comes for supper every Sunday after church. She started coming to St. Anne's with me, sitting in the fourth pew on the left, in what used to be Aldis's spot. Father Dare has stopped asking after Annalise. I am still her mother. I will be her mother on the day I die. That is not something you can sign away on a piece of paper in a lawyer's office. But I am no longer her resource. I am no longer her safety net, or her Moncton problem, or her widowmaker's near miss. I am Geraldine. I am a woman who fell down once and was caught, not by the daughter I made, but by the stranger who chose to stay. If you have a child like mine, I want you to hear this. Not all silence is grief. Some silence is the only sane answer to 47 unanswered calls. Some silence is what dignity sounds like, in a kitchen, with a cup of cold tea after you have finally stopped picking up. I have thought a great deal, in the months since that Sunday at St. Anne's, about how a person becomes the kind of daughter Annalise became. I don't think she woke up one morning and decided to ignore 47 phone calls. I think she made 1,000 smaller decisions before that, and each one cost her nothing, and so she made the next one. That is how it works. I have come to believe character is not a single grand choice. It is the accumulated weight of every small one. When I gave my daughter everything she asked for and never asked her for anything in return, I thought I was being a good mother. I was not. I was teaching her that my needs did not exist. I was teaching her that love was a one-way road, paved by me, traveled by her, with no toll booth at either end. And so when the toll came due, when a hospital telephone began to ring in Punta Cana, she did not even recognize it as a toll. She thought it was just more weather, inconvenient noise from the place I lived. I do not blame myself entirely. She had choices of her own to make, and she made them. But I have learned in my 68th year that a parent who never says no is not generous. She is afraid. And fear, dressed up as love, is one of the most damaging things you can hand to a child. What I want any mother reading this to hear, any father, any grandparent, anyone who has spent a lifetime swallowing the hurt because the alternative felt unbearable, is that dignity is not unkind. Saying no is not cruelty. Changing the locks is not abandonment. A line drawn in the sand at 68 is no less holy than a line drawn at 28. It is simply harder because you have spent so many years pretending the sand was infinite. Yolanda taught me something I want you to carry with you. She did not save my life because she was related to me. She saved my life because she had decided, long before she ever met me, what kind of person she was going to be when the moment came. Her mother had built that in her, one small choice at a time. With dandelions and missiles and quiet examples, I will never know. The result was a young woman in a gray cardigan who got into an ambulance with a stranger, because that was simply what she did. You are still building somebody every day with how you behave when nobody is watching. If you are raising a child, you are building them. If you are old like me, you are building the version of yourself that will sit in the kitchen one morning with a cold cup of tea, deciding whether to pick up the phone. The strength to set that phone down, gently, without screaming, without revenge, does not come from anger. It comes from years of small choices to value yourself, even quietly. Especially quietly. Start now. It is never too late, and the chickadees at the feeder do not care how old you are when you finally feed yourself first.